We always like to have definitive answers to questions, and we always like to say that X caused Y. Well, when you deal with the question about the causes of the War of 1812, you can really create confusion because it's not like other major conflagrations. I mean, what we have is that some events are a cause and some events produce a cause and effect reaction. So they're agents of causation. And I got all these things on my screen here. But for example, when you look at the sinking of the USS Maine in February of 1898, what you have there was a series of events that ultimately sparked or only created the Spanish-American War. And then, of course, if you've seen Animal House, the movie Animal House, when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, of course, we know it's really the Japanese, that drove the United States into the war, the Second World War. Now, more closely to our own time, there is the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001. And that event ultimately drove us into the war against terror. Now, what we have here in these three events are cause and effect reactions. However, some are not so easily defined. So we as informed people, and I think this is a wonderful assignment for teachers because it lets you ask your students questions, and when they offer answers, they're not necessarily wrong. Because as you see here, we have to examine events from multiple perspectives. We have to make value judgments. These change over time. And ultimately, we have to critically analyze documents. And as we critically analyze documents, well, they help us determine the sequence and influence of events. And then once we've done those things, we can offer an interpretation. So in effect, history is not really facts. And as I tell students all the time, history is not truth. There is not necessarily truth in history. It's a series of events that take place over time. And when we agree on the consensus of those events, that's the interpretation. And ultimately, that is an interpretation we agree upon. Well, okay. So the War of 1812. What happens in the War of 1812? Well, ultimately, when the United States secured its independence in 1783, it had a period of time where our relationship with the European countries was an ebb and flow. Against Great Britain, it tended to be up and down. In fact, the British held on to territory. What many people don't know is that the British held on to Detroit, Michigan, until 1795 in Jay's Treaty. They only gave it up then because Jay's Treaty secured it. And the reason they held on to it is because they claimed that Americans still owed money to British merchants. Well, yes, but we had been allied with France during the war, the American Revolution, and because of that, we were leaning toward France until 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution. And all of a sudden, chaos prevailed. It's kind of like today. Sometimes chaos prevails even in modern times. But in 1789, that was the beginning of the French Revolution. And by 1792, you had the wars of the French Revolution. And for 10 years, those wars would engage both England and France. Now, what was interesting about that was that the Washington administration took a position of neutrality. And by taking a position of neutrality, it basically said that the United States was going to be friendly with both, and allied with neither. Well, the reason for that is because Americans wanted to trade with both. And American trade flourished because of that position of neutrality. But by 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte had made himself the Emperor of France, and the war intensifies between England and France. And as this cartoon here shows you, by 1806, they had carved the world up. England was the mistress of the sea after the 1805 victory at Trafalgar, and Napoleon had won his magisterial victory at Austerlitz, and all of a sudden you had France as the master of the continent of Europe and England as the mistress of the seas. And ultimately what happens is that the United States was caught in between. Well, at that point in time, the administration of Thomas Jefferson tried to navigate this with a hindsight of what had happened during his formative years. His formative years were in the 1760s. That's when he was a young man. And at that point in time, the American colonies were using economic coercion against Great Britain to get their way. So as president, Jefferson fell back to that mindset. And in the war between Britain and France, Jefferson decided that we would take a neutral position, just like Washington had insisted. In fact, we would ultimately have a policy of non-importation because the British were starting to seize more American ships. And as they seized American ships, Americans were ultimately the victims of that. They lost commerce, they lost vessels, and more importantly, they lost men as the British impressed them into the British Navy. So as this cartoon shows you, the United States is in between, and both Britain and France seem to be fleecing our pockets. Well, in 1806, the Jefferson administration will sign a non-importation tax. We would not import anything from England and France that we could get elsewhere. Well, by 1807, things had begun to change drastically. In fact, the British had passed a series of orders in council, which had limited trade to continental Europe. And in fact, Napoleon had responded in 1806 with his Berlin Decree and his 1807 Milan Decree, which for all intents and purposes placed England, the English Isles, in a state of blockade. Now, France didn't have much of a navy, so it was a paper blockade. And although England had a fleet of more than 1,000 ships, they could not effectively blockade every port of Europe. So Americans saw the opportunity to continue trading because as the trade became more dangerous, it became more profitable. Well, in the summer of 1807, a dramatic event happened on the coast of Virginia. A U.S. warship, the USS Chesapeake, was setting off for a cruise of the Mediterranean. And as it was exiting the Virginia Capes, a British warship approached, fired a shot across the bow of the American ship. That was a signal. They wanted to talk. The American captain, James Barron, was convinced that the British wanted us to take mail to Europe for them. So he permitted a British officer to come aboard, and the British officer said they wanted to search the American ship for British deserters. And Barron said, no, you can't do that. And ultimately, what he decided was that since, well, very sensibly, since the British wanted to search his ship, he wasn't going to let a sovereign vessel be searched by an opposing nation. Well, the British officer went back aboard the Leopard, HMS Leopard, and fired a broadside of guns into the American ship. Now, the American ship was on a shakedown cruise. It's the first time it'd gone out to sea. It had baggage all over the decks, and the guns were rolled into the gun port. And ultimately, when the British fired on it, all of a sudden they had to react. They had to open the gun ports. They had to load the guns. They had to roll them out. And before they could do any of this, a second broadside of guns hit the American ship. And finally, a third broadside of guns hits the American ship before one American gun was fired. And at that point, Captain Barron lowered his flag, permitted the British to come aboard. At that point in time, Barron offered his sword to the British commander. The British refused. Instead, he demanded that the American crew be mustered and they be permitted to talk to every man to determine who the deserters were. Well, ultimately, they would find 4 individuals that they claimed had deserted from the British fleet, and they took them in chains back to the British fleet. Now, what most people don't know is that 3 of those 4 men were African Americans. They were black sailors. And it was claimed that they had deserted the British fleet, and all 3 of them claimed that they were Americans. They would be taken back to the British fleet. The British fleet would sail away. The American ship, with 18 holes in the hull, with 16 or so men killed, with a number of men, wounded, and with 5 or so men who died. The American ship limped back into Norfolk Harbor, and all of a sudden, Americans were just screaming out for war. The United States had been unprovokedly attacked by another sovereign nation. And what Americans claimed is that American sailors, American citizens had been seized by the British. What they didn't know is that 3 of the 4 were black sailors who were not considered to be citizens. But nonetheless, the rhetoric helped fuel the possibility of war. Well, the United States doesn't go to war in 1807. In fact, what Congress chooses to do is enforce an embargo. And for the next 16 months, the U.S. would not trade with any foreign nation. And as one Federalist said, this was like cutting one's throat to cure a nosebleed. It certainly killed the victim. But what happened was, during that period, the United States lost about $14 million of trade revenue. And it would be an utter disaster for the Jefferson administration. And shortly before Jefferson's presidency came to an end, the embargo would be repealed, and Congress would pass a Non-Intercourse Act. In other words, we would trade with other foreign nations except England and France. Well, the Non-Intercourse Act didn't work very well either. And during this reign, or the presidency, of Jefferson's successor, James Madison, Congress would amend the Non-Intercourse Act to Macon's Bill number 2, which said we would trade with both England and France until one of them repealed their restrictions against us, and then we would not trade with the other. Attempts at economic coercion. And ultimately, Napoleon used that as a ploy, claiming that he had repealed his Berlin and Milan decree. And ultimately, Madison bought that idea. So by 1810, we were on the precipice of war. And during the spring of 1812, President Madison sent letters to his friends, including Jefferson and James Monroe, asking what they thought he should do. And he finally drafted a war message to Congress. Well, that Congress had changed drastically. Well, what did he say the causes of the war were? Well, very simply, when you read that war message to Congress, that war message focuses on one thing. It focuses on the maritime issues. Well, he also mentions in that war message, he mentions at the very end of it, the problem with Native Americans. So can we accept Madison's note to Congress as the true meaning for what caused the War of 1812? Well, let me ask you, do you think a president would lie to us? We've seen more recently that presidents don't always tell the truth. Well, I think Madison was telling the truth from his perspective. But there's also a growing change in America since 1810, especially in Congress. You'd had the emergence of a group, the emergence of a group of war hawks. These are primarily Southern and Western congressmen, people like John C. Calhoun from the uplands of South Carolina, Henry Clay from Kentucky, John Sevier and Felix Grundy from Tennessee, Peter Porter from the Buffalo area of New York, and then Langdon Chevy's. I always tell my students, Langdon Chevy's sounds like a fine bottle of wine. Well, he is a South Carolinian who serves as Speaker of the House during the War of 1812. He serves as the first president of the second BUS, and in 1816, he was actually nominated to be president of the United States. Here was someone who was a rising star, but he did not seek more power. But these war hawks, beginning in 1810, they began agitating and pushing for war with Great Britain. They claimed the United States had been humiliated too much. We had been abused by the British, and it was time for the United States to stand up for itself. So, what were the causes of the War of 1812? Well, as Madison said, it was these maritime issues. He said it was the fact that the British were impressing American sailors, the fact that they had fired on the USS Chesapeake, and the fact that they were seizing American ships, condemning the cargoes, condemning the ships. And it's really a question about free trade. Americans had bought into the concept of free trade. And once Britain and France had begun war, the British had fallen back on what was called the Rule of 1756, which said that if you didn't trade with someone in peacetime, you couldn't trade with them in wartime. Well, what Americans did, they developed a counter argument. They would go to Spanish and French colonies in the Caribbean. They would load up with sugar and other things, and they would come back to places like Savannah or Charleston. They would come into harbor. They wouldn't offload the ship, but they'd come in and they'd have a custom house official sign their documents, sign their letter books, and then they would sail off to Europe, claiming that those goods were now American because they had broken the voyage. So the American, it was the doctrine of the broken voyage. You break the voyage, it becomes American goods. So they're neutral, so you can transport them to Europe and trade them. Well, in 1805, the British Admiralty Court ruled in the Essex case that there was no such thing as a broken voyage. It was a continuous voyage. So those goods were still contraband good, and the British would seize American ships. And if they seized a ship of sugar and took it into a port to be adjudicated, ultimately what would happen is that they would, days would pass, and the longer that sugar sat on a wet ship, the more it began to spoil. And you would have British agents come in and buy it for a fraction of the price rather than the ship to be, the cargo to be spoiled and condemned. Well, these maritime issues were major driving factors of the war with Britain. And then there was that problem, as Madison mentions, the incitement of the Indians. The British had been inciting Indians in the Northwest to provide a wall against American expansion. And in the Southwest, you had the Spanish doing the same thing. And as the war begins, the British are also going to mobilize slaves. That's actually a book that I've written. I wrote a book called The Slave's Gamble. I didn't put it on your bibliography list, but it's a book. It talks about how the British used slaves during the War of 1812. Now, historians have also dealt with other questions about what had caused the war. And in fact, a historian by the name of I'm having my sinuses are bothering me here. A historian by the name of Julius Pratt had talked about Western land hunger, as did Louis Hacker. How Americans, these war hawks, especially wanted to use war to gain more territory. For example, take Canada from the British, and to also potentially take Florida from the Spanish. I mean, look at Florida. Florida it resembled a pistol, with the barrel being that panhandle region that points directly to the Mississippi River. So these war hawks believed that we had to take Canada, we had to take Florida, and of course we would be taking them from other European powers. So land hunger is a rationale for the war. The war hawks talked about it. There was also this question about a depressed economy. George Rogers Taylor talks about how the maritime seizure of American ships and the economic coercion that the Americans had tried had really depressed American farm prices. And a woman who was a political scientist at my alma mater, Auburn, her name is, I'm having a mind freeze here, Margaret Latimer. She talked about how South Carolina wanted to fight a war because they believed it would create an economic boom for the South Carolina agricultural industry. So declining agricultural prices could be raised with a war. So war would improve the economy. So this is a motivation, a rationale for fighting a war. And then there were also psychological or ideological reasons. Well, these psychological, ideological reasons, war hawks had talked about how we had been humiliated, how we had been abused by the British. The British had treated us like we were a stepchild, even though we had secured our independence from Great Britain. Well, only what happens here, this is one of my favorite cartoons. It shows little Jimmy Madison, all 5'3" of him, punching big 6 foot tall George III and his nose bleeding. Well, the psychological, ideological reasons do help drive the possibility of war. And then there's also the liberal impulse for war. And this is an important book written by a guy named Stephen Watts, who's at the University of Missouri. He talks about how during the early 19th century, there's a transformation that's occurring in the economy, a transformation from this Republican vision of a pastoral agricultural nation in which Americans were, they believed in virtue and national unity, but we were moving towards a more liberal capitalistic society, a more urban and industrialized version of American, and an America that interconnected to the outside world. And with that is going to come social mobility and pragmatic self-interest and avaricious individualism. And what he says is that this change that is occurring creates a transformation. It creates intense anxiety and apprehension, and that the War of 1812, it exacerbated those tensions, and it put the country on the path to economic modernity. Well, if you follow what happens after the war, We generally refer to it as the market revolution. So he has some degree of truth in that. Well, what happens during the war? The war is a hodgepodge of successes and failures. Americans begin the war with great hope and expectation. There'd be a three-pronged campaign to take Canada, ultimately fighting along the New England or the Michigan border. You would have William Hull, who was supposed to invade up the Upper Peninsula. He would be joined by Stephen Van Rensselaer crossing the Niagara frontier, and they would join up together, and then they would move on up towards Quebec and Montreal. A third expedition would go up the Lake Champlain corridor led by Henry Dearborn, the former Secretary of War, and ultimately all three of these expeditions failed miserably. Well, because of that, afterwards, the war on the northern frontier is a tug of war, especially in the Niagara frontier region. In this fall, September of 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry will win a major victory on Lake Erie. And by winning that victory, the British have to evacuate Detroit because Lake Erie was the communications, the access avenue from Lake Ontario to Michigan. And as the British evacuated, William Henry Harrison pursued the British, and he attacked them at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. And it was during that engagement there that a fairly obscure Kentuckian named Richard Mentor Johnson would gain national recognition as being the man who killed Tecumseh. And as he killed Tecumseh, the Native American Confederation in the North began to crumble. Well, as the war on the northern frontier turned into more or less a stalemate, the British would turn their interest to the Chesapeake Bay, which would be the next theater of campaigns. And ultimately, the Americans, they didn't have enough soldiers. You know, we had very little army. The Republicans had relied on the militia. We only had about 7,000 soldiers in uniform, so we had roughly 3 million militiamen, but, you know, they performed poorly like they did during the American Revolution. And our ships, they were mostly gunboats. We had 16 capital vessels. We had 160 gunboats, and those gunboats, they're for coastal defense. They're not for sailing out to sea. Now, ultimately, the American ships that had gone out to sea had done well because they had had experience from the Quasi-War with France and from the Barbary of the Tripolitan Wars against the pirates in North Africa. So ultimately, what we have here is that the war in the Northwest will be successful for the Americans. The war on the Niagara frontier stalemates. The St. Lawrence Lake Champlain region is going to be a stalemate as well. And by 1813, the British will focus on the Chesapeake Bay, where they looted, pillaged, and plundered. And by 1814, things began to change. In fact, on March 27th, Andrew Jackson defeated in the South, in the Mississippi Territory. He won a major victory at Horseshoe Bend 4 days later. And that victory there, it ended the Creek Civil War. And it basically, he forced the Indians to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, where they gave up 2/3 of Georgia and much of the Mississippi Territory to Americans. Well, 4 days after that, ultimately what you're going to have was that Napoleon will be defeated the first time and be exiled to the island of Elba. And the British will begin a four-pronged campaign for the end of the war. They would intensify the blockade. That would be very successful. They would have sporadic raids, and these raids had success, and some had failures. In fact, as we know, in August 1814, the British sacked the American capital, burned the American capital and the president's mansion. And in September 12th, 1814, they attacked Baltimore. And of course, the victory there by Fort McHenry to keep the British ships out of the harbor was a great success. In fact, an Annapolis lawyer wrote a poem about it called The Defense of Fort McHenry that ultimately became the Star-Spangled Banner. Well, after that's the second, the sporadic raids, successes and failures. The third objective was going to be to slice off the New England states down the Lake Champlain corridor. But they had to win a victory, and that victory would come at Lake Champlain, where Thomas McDonough and American gunboats would win the day and keep the British from slicing New England off from the rest of the American states. The fourth objective in 1814 was the British to take New Orleans. And ultimately that objective was going to be stifled as well. As Andy Jackson defeated, he assembled what I call the first great American army, because it was Spaniards and Frenchmen and frontiersmen from Tennessee and Kentucky, and it was Bartarian pirates, and it was free men of color, and it was slaves, and it was 53 Choctaw Indians, and then Jean Lafitte and his Bartarian pirates. That was this melting pot of Americans that he assembled. And of course, he had an advantage of terrain, and he defeated on January 8th, 1850, he defeated the British at Chalmette. Well, some people say that that battle was unnecessary because the treaty again had been signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. But as I tell students all the time, they didn't have internet. They couldn't, they didn't have social media. They couldn't put it on Facebook or tweet that the peace treaty had been agreed upon. Well, ultimately what's going to happen is that what happened in the war? Well, the war stirred up American nationalism. Americans finally became convinced that they were free of Great Britain. They had won political independence, and now they felt they'd won economic independence. And we enshrined a new pantheon of American heroes, people like Andrew Jackson and Oliver Hazard Perry and William Henry Harrison and Thomas McDonough and people like that. And then the selective memory minimized the losses. Our nation capital was burned, but we kicked the hell out of the British at the Battle of New Orleans. And then what about the causes? Well, maritime issues, they're settled, but not because of the Americans, because the war in Europe ends. And then the Indian problem, it's settled as the major tribes in the north and the south are defeated. And then there's that land hunger. It's going to be satisfied as new lands open up in the northwest and in the southwest. In fact, in the southwest, it opens up the opportunity to expand the slavery plantation empire, the old South. And then that depressed economy, it improved as peacetime trade resumed. And after the war, we have an era of good feelings. And psychologically, well, that new sense of nationalism, Americans boasted that they had defeated the British. And then that liberal anxiety, it is justified. So what can we say? What caused the War of 1812? Well, very simply, or should I say, very complicatedly, many events converge to convince Americans that their only recourse was war. And it reconfirms the simple idea that most of the time history is not explained by a single easily defined reason. History has many causes. Events have many causes. So thank you very much.